All right, you've heard it here. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a celebration of literature and living writers. I'm Megan Marshall. I'm the director of the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers series. And tonight we honor El Dia de los Muertos and many other things, just being here together with an amazing author who has stayed up very late to join us all the way from Ithaca, New York. And even though we are coming to you via Zoom tonight, I want to acknowledge the Kumeyaay land that we are privileged to inhabit and share here in San Diego. As members of the SDSU community, we acknowledge, respect, and celebrate their legacy. I'd also like to take a moment to thank those who have helped to make this event possible, and that includes my fabulous co-host, Marco Tumlin, and our other friends from Love Library, Danya Muka Hall, Laurel Bliss, and Rebecca Williamson. I'd also like to thank the Department of English and Comparative Literature and instructionally related activities for their continued support of the series. Just a couple reminders. I know this is not our first rodeo, but if you're joining us via Zoom, please keep your mic muted during the presentation and know, as mentioned, that it is being recorded. If you'd like to view the recording after the event has concluded, in addition to tons of other awesome living writers related content, please check us out on YouTube, the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers channel. There will be time for Q&A after the reading portion tonight, so feel free to share any questions you might have at that point. Without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our featured reader. Raul Palma is the author of the novel A Haunting in Hialeah Gardens, which just came out this year, and the story collection In This World of Ultraviolet Light, which won the Don Belton Prize in 2021. His stories and essays have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, Hayden's Ferry Review, Smokelong Quarterly, and the Sonora Review, amongst other journals. His very short fiction was included in Best Small Fictions 2018, which was selected by Aimee Bender. Additionally, his work has been supported with fellowships and scholarships from the Cuba One Foundation, the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center, the Santa Fe Writers Conference, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Sundress Academy for the Arts. In the community, Palma has taught at Elmira Correctional through Cornell's prison education program. He is also a member of the fiction faculty at Ithaca College and the Associate Dean of Faculty and New Initiatives in Ithaca College's School of Humanities and Sciences. I was first introduced to Raul Palma's work when I happened upon the story Stand Your Ground in an issue of Hayden's Ferry Review. I was struck instantly by the unique style, voice, and conflict, and like a truly impactful work of art, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way in which the protagonist was addicted to breaking things, because in a time when it seemed like anything could break, he was intent on making sure. When I was able to dive deeper into Palma's collection In This World of Ultraviolet Light, I remained in awe of his ability to craft dynamic characters that radiate light into dark places, and sometimes vice versa, and of the way in which his carefully wrought narratives made me feel so immersed and connected to a city that I had never visited. Of his work, author Joy Castro raves, saturated with tenderness and longing, these shimmering stories illuminate the soft, weird underbelly of psyches as brutal and exquisite as real life. For all who care about contemporary fiction, Latinx and Cuban American experiences in the 21st century, or La Ciudad Mágica of Miami, Palma's debut collection is a must-read. So please join me in welcoming Raul Palma.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Megan. Such an honor to be here tonight. It's such a cool way to stay up past my bedtime, right? I really, these days, I'm in bed by 8:30. But I had an extra cup of coffee. So, and looking forward to sharing some work and answering some questions in the Q&A later. I'm going to read, actually, I'm going to read the story Stand Your Ground. And it'll go about 20 minutes, maybe a little less. And then I think that'll leave enough time for some conversation. So here we go. Stand your ground. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome.
Yes, yeah, great.
After my shift, Rafa would scoop me up and then we'd go vandalize people's homes. Every night, it seemed we were rolling through the city of Miami, PD Pablo blasting, a couple of spiked cherry Slurpees in our hands. We'd take turns leaning out the passenger window, swinging baseball bats at mailboxes, knocking them clean off, or we'd dash onto strangers' lawns in places with names like the Gables or Coco Plum, knocking over fountains and peeling out. We were addicted to breaking things. In a time when it seemed like anything could break, we were intent on making sure. We liked toppling fountains the best. They were the stupidest ornaments, but this kind of vandalism had its risks. It took quite some strength to get under so much stone and water and lift. If you weren't careful, you could trip on all the wires and lights, or worse, parts of the fountain could cascade on you, and then you'd have to get the rubble off before escaping. This happened to Rafa once. A big old 5-tier toppled right on him. I had to get out of the car and help the motherfucker. And lucky for us, the owners didn't hear the commotion. They didn't reach for their gun and meet us on the lawn, stand your ground style. Or maybe I wouldn't be here telling you this story. This was Miami, in or about the months following the September 11th attacks. All of the city was covered in those $2 Home Depot American flags. And I don't know why, but something about seeing those colors draped over the city made me and Rafa want to rip out every last one of them. Maybe that's how all this vandalizing started, with me and Rafa driving around collecting flags, collecting so many that in a week, we filled 4 garbage bags worth. And when we didn't have space for so much patriotism, we drove to the Everglades, set them atop cardboard, and burned them all, and watched as the wind carried them, still burning, into the dry grass across Tamiami Trail. We were students at Florida International University, first years. I was circling the drain around the business school. Rafa wasn't even attending some classes. We'd sat next to each other during orientation, and poor guy, some righteous acting advisor, took to the stage to patronize us all. Wake up, kids, you're in college now. You got to have a plan to succeed. Dude was up there shouting out these cliches, trying to rouse the masses, when out of the blue, he pointed to Rafa and asked, how about you? Rafa, who was maybe the only darker guy in the crowd, was not having it. The man asked, what's your major? He even jumped off the stage to thrust the mic in Rafa's face. And what did my childhood friend say, still yawning and rubbing his eyes from the boredom? Guy, I don't know. Well, that must have been the answer that unmotivational speaker had been hoping for, because the dude fixed his bow tie and said, you don't know, your major. What a way to start college. He hit the mark, though. Neither of us were off to a good start. I was still clocking in 30 plus hours at Walgreens, at the threshold of full-time work, trying to do my part to help my mom. I had no time to study. Plus, it was so hard to take college seriously. In one lab, we spent the first 2 weeks measuring the distance between the anus and the mouth of various mollusks. It seemed like one giant joke. In lectures, I could hardly stay focused, and I was certain that I would flunk out by the end of the year. And Rafa, he was doing just as bad. In some Latin American history course, he was learning about castes and colonialism and how sexual violence gave rise to economics of legitimacy. And rather than feeling empowered with that knowledge, he was coming unstitched. In his creative writing course, when asked to describe something tangible in the room, he'd chosen his own hand, its color, a café con leche. And just thinking of the sugar drove his imagination to the Cuban countryside, the plantations, the hands of his ancestors ragged from the machete handle, and the culling of sugarcane. Rafa had said that merely reading the poem aloud made his eyes watery, and he laughed about it, about being a dude on the brink of tears. But then his demeanor changed when he described the professor's feedback. Nice, imaginative. But the assignment was to focus on something tangible in the room. Was I not sitting right there, Rafa asked, in front of him? He probably meant something physical. What, so you agree with him? Rafa, I told him. You can't take things so personally. Oh, yeah, he said, and he told me what happened next. Some dude shared a poem dedicated to a female student in the class. My first thought, that's kind of cool. I'd never thought of using poetry for anything like that. And I joked that maybe I should start writing poetry too. But Rafa was angry, and I didn't know why. Maybe I was distracted or bored, but he was getting all worked up over lines from this dude's poem, firm as mangoes, and bruised and sunburst and begging for a bite. I didn't mind the imagery, to be honest, and I told Rafa as much. And at this, while walking through campus right in front of everyone, he said, "Fuck you." What? Why? Because you don't even know how ignorant you are, he said, with such authority. I like mangoes. The woman walked out of the class. He was writing about her body, idiot. Harsh. Something was changing in him. We'd be watching television or something like we'd done a gazillion times, and J-Lo would come on in some performance, and I'd say, "Look at that ass." And Rafa would smack me really hard. Dude, do you gotta be like that? I guess he thought I was objectifying her. I'd only said it because we'd always said shit like that when we saw J-Lo. It didn't take long to feel like we were on the outs with one another. The school year had barely gotten rolling, and he'd started hanging out with new people. The kind of people who stand outside fraternities in the heat with signs like "real men take no" for an answer, and "my dress does not mean yes." I made fun of him for that, and he didn't appreciate the jokes. More so, from what I could tell, he'd stopped going to class entirely. Every night I'd be like, "Yo, Rafa, we got to make some time to hit the books. It's been a while." I missed him, if I'm being totally honest. I'd grown up with a guy my whole life, but he had no interest in studying, and the things he said scared me. One time he came right out and responded, "What for? What can college even really offer me?" Then, after a long pause, he said, "You know what I miss? Driving around and fucking things up." So that's what we did. Every night. By the time the Twin Towers fell on September 11th, neither me nor Rafa were particularly shook. If I'm being totally honest, it was such a huge fucking relief that the world could end. My parents were at work already. Rafa was over, and we were having leftover Taco Bell for breakfast, watching the buildings fall to A Tribe Called Quest, Can I Kick It? Even if my manager hadn't called to say the store was closed, I wouldn't have shown up. I wouldn't have shown up to class either. After breakfast, Rafa and I drove to the beach. We walked to the shore and smoked, and he asked, "Can we do what we want now? Do we have permission?" It seemed that way. It seemed like the tragedy had cleaved a hole in Miami large enough for us to hide in. It was the first time that I looked at Miami, its skyline, and thought, would it be so bad if the planes had all crashed here? Down the street, there was this Muslim kid named Sohail, a tall high school senior who loved sneakers and Star Trek t-shirts. He was by all accounts a giant dork. Neither me nor Rafa had ever given him much attention, even if we were neighbors, but after the attacks, we started hanging out. He was good for scoring an ounce on short notice, so one thing led to another, and before long, he was part of the crew. We'd even taken him to vandalize things, and boy, was he a menace to society. One time, while sitting in a drive-thru at McDonald's and waiting for our food, he jumped the fence into the playground and under the cover of night, ripped a Ronald McDonald statue out from the ground. How he didn't get caught, how any of us didn't, I have no clue, because next thing I knew, food in hand, we pulled up by the playground, and there was Sohail popping the trunk and loading Ronald into the back of Rafa's Ford Bronco. It was such an excellent night. Cruising around town, jamming with McDonald himself in the back. But when the party was over, we had to say goodbye. We drove up to the top of the Rickenbacker Causeway, a tall bridge that arches over Key Biscayne, and we threw it off and into the current, watched it bob and drift out into the dark. That's how things were when Sohail would join us. He didn't just want to destroy mailboxes, he wanted to set them on fire. And he didn't care much for the small decorative fountains that people kept out in their yards. He was more interested in the large and extravagant public ones. In fact, it was Sohail who in November toppled to the Coconut Grove Mall fountain at the peak of dinner time and narrowly escaped as the community's heightened security descended on him. Just to be an asshole, he did it shirtless, wearing a black turban and yelling, yeah, 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 yeah. The guy even made the news. It was legendary. And we all had a good laugh. So understandably, we were saddened when Sohail stopped hanging out with us. Dude wouldn't even pick up his phone. Turned out, his parents had found his stash. By the time the holidays were upon us, he was so grounded, he couldn't even look out his window when we'd tap. By then, most of Miami had unboxed their Christmas decorations. All of the city shimmered at night. It was merriment galore. So many lights, so many inflatables and nativities, and you name it. It was enough to make us forget about flunking out and dead-end jobs and all the injustices we'd witnessed in college. We suspected that's what the decorations were for, to hide all the ugly of the world and help us stay distracted. How badly the country wanted to move on. The sentiment was everywhere. The media insisted that we not let the terrorists kill Christmas too. Politicians proclaimed, be brave, go shopping, your country needs you. Even with the White House closed to the public, Laura Bush hauled in Christmas trees and continued with the tradition, with the theme, home for the holidays. There were stories of generous men, one who even traveled from Missouri to New York City with a wad of Benjamins, giving one to anybody who looked needy. And these stories worked. We forgot about the fear, the vulnerability. We were too merry to pay attention as security measures increased, or to see George W. escalating tensions with Iraq. None of that mattered to us. The only thing we mourned was that Sohail was grounded, and we were without weed, and we didn't know what to do. We were bored. Everywhere we looked, there were decorations, too joyous and beautiful to smash. Until one day, there was only Christmas nonsense on the radio. And we were jamming to Last Christmas for like the 5th time. And I said, Rafa, bro, pull over. So he did. And I walked through someone's winter wonderland of a yard, right up to a plastic Santa, the same rosy-nosed kind my parents had when I was a kid. And I punched it in the face, my knuckles crushing through into the hollow, illuminated space. It was glorious. My fist was bleeding. And Rafa was laughing and hollering and looking around at the string of lights, the inflatable snowmen, and the rows of candy canes. I knew what we'd do next. We'd turn our attention from fountains to smashing Santas. We started out small, yanking Christmas lights off trees and rooftops. One night, we realized that we could redecorate people's homes so that it seemed all those decorations were having an orgy. It was utter bacchanalia, what we were after. We could have an illuminated deer humping the Virgin Mary, and we could have Santa humping the deer, and we could duct tape Jesus and his little pecker to Santa's face. The possibilities were endless. And at around the time that some shit-faced British dude hid an explosive in his shoe on a flight to Miami, we really hit our fucking stride. It was classic. Our favorite activity, dubbed football practice, involved tackling the inflatables. It's super fun. Just find a neighborhood that's Christmas heavy, and you park at one end, then you walk over to the other end. This works best when it's you and a friend because you can race, and you can race, and you can then walk over to the other end, and you could keep a tally of how many figures you've tackled. Rafa and I would line up each on different sides of the street. Then we'd count to 3 and begin the mayhem, diving into every inflatable character along the way, grabbing Santas and body slamming them, or jumping right into Mickey's faces. Even if these are sacks of air, the activity could be a bit iffy, because most of the inflatables are actually anchored to the ground. When you tackle them, the anchors come loose, and they can gouge the living shit out of you. It happened to me, luckily. One nicked me, but but got my jeans good. I dragged the Mickey half a block. The fucker wouldn't let loose. When I jumped in the truck, I took him with me. Like anything, though, eventually the thrill of Christmas bashing grew dim, and we began to eye larger targets. We spent a weekend visiting local dealerships at night and slashing their mega giant inflatables, the kind you could see blocks away. Those were so dense with air that when we try and tackle them, we just bounce right off. That's why we used my steak knife, my favorite thing. When the big ones start to come down, it looks like they're going to crush you. They just buckle over and descend upon you from like 20 feet in the air. And there's no thrill like running wildly with all that hot air blowing up dust and dirt. Did it make me a little sad? Sure. I'd been a kid once. I knew what it meant to pass one of those mega inflatables on the highway, parents bickering, a little hope and Christmas cheer looming over the whole stretch of the city, but fuck it. In our headspace, we needed it. Hell, given the chance, I'm not sure we'd have balked at hitting one of those towers ourselves. Maybe we would have destroyed Christmas that season for all of Miami. But one night, on a routine job rearranging someone's yard, cops showed up. They rolled into the neighborhood real slow, like lights off, and we didn't even see them until they were up close. It was Harafa, in fact, who shouted, "Pigs!" Lucky for us, we'd become cautious and we'd parked on another block. So by the time the police lights blasted on, we'd already dipped over a few yards into our getaway and we'd fled. But that next morning, we were heated. All the news channels took a break with a Muslim extremist bullshit to cover our Christmas bashing. It was a big news story. Reporters had descended on all of Miami, interviewing people, collecting surveillance tapes. The police even put out a reward for anyone with more information that could lead to an arrest. Suffice it to say, we were in deep shit. And rather than venturing out each night to kill the town, we'd gather around the TV at Rafa's place and watch the news. Seeing kids sob and tell their stories about ruined Christmases made us a little sad, of course, but we also loved the attention. We loved the feeling of having done something in secret, of having gotten away. Sometimes the news stations would play grainy videos of us in action, and it was glorious. It was like reliving the Christmas bashing. And there was something else that was happening. Our violence was bringing the community together. Neighbors were chipping in and replacing each other's broken Christmas decorations. Look, I told Rafa, it's like we're the spirit of Christmas. But the attention scared us plenty. So we stopped, kind of. The last time we fought Christmas was at the start of the spring semester. Anyone with decorations still out, we'd reason deserved a bit of ultra vandalism. I'm not sure what got us back into smashing Santas. I remember that we were watching W's State of the Union address, and he'd said something about an axis of evil. And Rafa had said, you know what would be an axis of good? Since I'd known Rafa all my life, I knew just what the answer was. Tell me Christmas bashing. I know what you're thinking. How could we outdo ourselves? What was there beyond football practice and the toppling of mega inflatables at the dealership? In truth, not much. But there was something unresolved. It was more of a joke, certainly not something that would draw attention. I still remember when the seed of the idea came to me. We were circling our own block, sharing a joint, and I said, isn't it strange that his house is the only one on our block not decorated? So hail? Yeah, I said. Everyone around here decorates like mad. Rafa laughed. Yeah, man, fucking Christmas Central, bro. Know what? We should decorate his place. Just imagine how he'd react. Bro, Rafa said, driving right past it, blunt in hand. Yes, but you really want to shit where you eat where you shit. We'd never done anything like this in our block. I don't know. What do you think? I think he'd love it. I think it'd make his grounding more enjoyable, I said. But then I second-guessed myself. We were wanted, after all. And I told Rafa that we should definitely hold off, even if we missed the dude. Still, it didn't stop us from joking about it. It should have stayed a joke. So when we did venture back onto the vandalism circuit on January 29th, we were in good spirits. We thought of ourselves as custodians of the city, picking up the mess left over by Christmas. We plucked some of those lighted deer from the Biltmore Hotel, only the best for Soheo. Then we swung by the Church of the Little Flower, which has this super nice life-size nativity. It was all a bit much to take, but we managed to pluck out the whitest little baby Jesus, Mary and Joseph. On the way back to our block, we stopped here and there gathering strings of light and inflatables. Then near Coral Park, we saw the coolest thing, a pink flamingo. Figurine with a Santa hat, all lit up. And it wasn't the cheap plastic variety. This was a woodcut, beautifully crafted, smooth to the touch. So we ripped that bad boy out, slid it over the rest of our booty, and feeling good, went to Soheo's place. It must have been 3 a.m. This time of night, our block was dead. We parked under a tree in the little shade blocking the moonlight, and feeling quite comfortable and at home, we set out to decorate Soheo's place the best we could. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Losing my voice. We envisioned a Christmas palace, the kind of house that all the people of Greater South Florida would pilgrimage to just to see. What a shame that Soheo's family didn't decorate. Their yard was perfect. Lots of grass, just a few palms. We found the perfect place for the nativity in a bed of white and pink petunias surrounded by mulch. Since we hadn't been able to fit the cow and sheep and the donkey in the truck, we situated the deer around the nativity, and the pink flamingo too, as witnesses to the birth of Christ. All along the way, we anchored down inflatables of every variety, but we held off on plugging them in because we didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. We worked silently, wrapping lights around palm trees and attaching all these cords together with the extension cords we'd swiped. Before we plugged it all in, Rafa and I stood proud of the work we'd done. Sorry, y'all.
Take your time, no worries.
Oh, yeah. Proud of the work we'd done. We'd bump fists, and he said something like, "We've been breaking things so long, I forgot what making something felt like." He was right. I took the end of the electrical cord, the master cord that we had managed to attach everything to, and I walked it over to the side of the house where I knew there was an outdoor outlet. I plugged it in, and Jesus, it was gorgeous. The fans and the inflatables whirred, and the bags of air stirred and rose. That's when I noticed the pigs, fucking devils. They'd been smart this time. They'd likely parked further down the street. They'd likely parked further down the street to avoid detection. All that time we'd been decorating, and little did we know that there were 4 officers closing in on us. Rafa was standing right in front of the doorway, really relishing all of it. It was the most joy I'd seen on his face. But I needed to warn him that we were busted. And I didn't know what to do. If I ran out toward him and yelled, it would reveal my position and I'd get busted too. If I fled, then I'd feel guilty for letting him take the blame. And as I breathed and tried to control my heart rate and thought through what course of action I should take, I heard the front door to Soheil's house open. And I saw the shadow of a man cross over Rafa. It was Soheil's father, and he was holding a gun, a fucking real life gun. Soheil's dad must have been scared especially with all that anti-Muslim shit in the media. And maybe building a nativity on a Muslim man's house was a tad insensitive. Couldn't he see, though, how funny it was? Couldn't he see how such a prank would make his son laugh? I don't know how else to make sense of it, because next thing I knew, the pigs drew their weapons. One stepped into the light and shouted, "Put that down right now." So Hale's father, barefoot, shirtless, and only in his plaid boxer shorts, was trembling. He knew what I didn't know then. It took Trayvon Martin, Marquise McLaughlin, and Jordan Davis, and all the other casualties for me to know why Sohail's father looked like he could piss his pants. So when he eventually did put his weapon down and motioned as if to say something, an officer tased him unconscious. And Rafa, who was already on his knees, hands behind his head, gave me a look as if to say, "Just run, man. No use in us both going down." But where could I run to? I saw Sohail step into his yard, sporting his Star Trek pajamas. The guy was utterly dazed by the lights and the cops and the whole of it. He collapsed on his father and sobbed, and I saw another cop draw his weapon. So I hid behind the AC unit, and I waited all night because I was scared. I waited for the police and the ambulance to leave. And when all was clear, when Rafa had been taken into custody, his truck impounded, I walked home, showered, and then drove to campus to measure mollusks and their fucking assholes. Thank you all. Thank you for hanging in with me for this one.
Thank you so much, Raul. And well, firstly, thank you for reading my mind and choosing that story to share it with us tonight. And I mean, all of y'all who are listening, I imagine you can see why, now if you haven't read the book, you're going to have to go out and get it just to read more of that work. So let's take a minute to maybe show Raul our appreciation. If you want to unmute yourself, give a little clap. Very much appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of the things about having our events on Zoom, right, is that it's you don't get to get the sense of your audience, right? So just, sometimes it's nice to know that we are out here. Okay, so now we will have some time for a few questions. So if you have a question, feel free to use the little hand raise function on Zoom, and I'll call on y'all as I see you pop up. You can also put questions into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that as well. And we'll just make sure we can get to as many as possible with the time we have allotted. Let's see. I think Ben has a question in the chat. So Ben says, are Rafa and the narrator the same two guys from Stand Your Ground, the Stand Your Ground story, also in All Along the Hills? Or are they like the same characters as those from in the first story in the collection?
It's really funny. My wife and I talk about this a lot because she says that I'm really bad at names. Really bad. So they're actually two different Hirafas entirely. And she was always like, but everybody's going to think they're the same Hirafa. And but no, they're not. I guess it's not linked in that way. But I think it because the names are similar, it probably begs that association.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this being a story cycle in the sense that all of them share the setting, right? So we see the connections amongst other things. So I think maybe that's another reason why we may have wanted to make the connection between those two stories as well. All right, let's see. Okay, Robert put a question into the chat. He said, thanks for doing this. What are some aspects of Miami as an idea and a setting that you wanted to use in your stories that you felt had not been given their due in other media?
It's a great question. Because I think Miami in particular is a city that has a really big presence in kind of the popular imaginary. and it's historical, from its origin, there's this story that some of you, I don't know if any of you have spent any time in Miami, but growing up in Miami, there's a story you hear in school. And the story is that there was a woman by the name of Julia Tuttle who kind of convinced Henry Flagler to build the railroad down to Miami. And she did so by mailing him an orange blossom during a freeze. Right. And the story is that he got the orange blossom and was like, wow, it's warm down there. I'm gonna build the railroad down there, right? And it's actually somewhat fabricated and not entirely accurate, right? There are kind of like these popular ideas that I think from the very founding of Miami, that kind of cluster together. Like you get Miami Vice, LeBron, right, Messi, the place where there's a beach where you could leave corporate America or get out of college and go to spring break, and these kinds of ideas, right? And what's striking about Miami is that they're present. These kind of images are present there. And I think they inform the way that Miami has developed physically as a city. But I guess to go to more specifically address the question, right? What I'm really trying to get at here is I'm trying to target some of those popular ideas about Miami, right? And then just kind of break them open, right? Where, yeah, sure, Miami has beaches, it's nice, that kind of thing, but it's complicated, right? So, there's so much media out there, and there's so many representations of Miami, and more recently, there are a lot of really exciting things happening in that realm. But I would say that's the main idea. Take dominant ideas, whatever comes to your head right away when you think of Miami, right? To somehow break that open and show that it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, we definitely appreciated that subversion of some of the popular mythos. And kind of, I mean, you may have gotten to this already, but just because it's a connected question, and then Manuel, I'm going to get to you. Sarah in the chat asked that, did writing the story collection change your perspective on Miami or its mythos at all?
I'd say, Miami is my project. And a lot of the research that I did, just because I'm interested in that project, definitely changed my perspective of having grown up there. I grew up in Miami in the 80s and the 90s, right? On Calle Ocho, which at the time was like a 2-lane highway, right? Now it's like this mega highway, right, that cuts through the city. And there's kind of a danger sometimes when I'm writing about Miami that, I get nostalgic. I live up north. I'm like, oh, let me access that time of my youth, right? There's a danger in kind of creating these mere echoes of what I experienced at a particular time and place. I think what writing the collection or these stories over time helped me do was try to kind of keep myself in check, right? Like I love writing about Miami, but it's because it's a city kind of going through these seismic changes. It's a city on the edge environmentally, politically, a global city, right? Which is seeing like a whole influx of, in terms of migration and economics, you name it. So I think the quick answer to it is I think that writing the collection early on, writing some of these stories made me realize that, because I started asking, why am I doing this? Right. And made me realize that the reason I want to tell these stories is because I think the stories we tell about a city or a place really matter. Right. And I wanted to see how I could challenge the stories maybe that I'd grown up with a bit. And at the same time, maybe expand the vision of the kinds of stories that we could tell of a city like Miami.
Thank you. Okay, Manuel, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so since we're talking about the whole aspect of Miami and whatnot, my question is, I saw that also that you've lived in Chicago and then also Nebraska, I believe. And so my question is, like, I understand that you lived in Miami for 25 years. Technically, that should be like the reason why you picked Miami. But why not Nebraska? Why not Chicago? Why not Cuba? Or why not somewhere else? Do you think that that wouldn't have the same impact in your whole story in general? Or did you pick Miami because it's what you know, and since you know, it's like a comfort zone type of thing?
And it actually, right, I think in the collection it probably leans, of course, heavily toward Miami. There are like slight references of Chicago. I maybe nothing of Nebraska, and certainly nothing of Ithaca, right? The novel, I think, it shows a bit more of my cards, having spent a little more time in the Midwest, and other projects to lean that way. I think for me, it was interesting. I really started writing about Miami when I moved away. So I first moved to Chicago, and there was something about being away, right? Maybe feeling isolated in some sense from my community, from my friends, that made me feel like I wanted to access that or remember it somehow. So I started there. I started writing about Miami because of that. Interesting, right? At this stage, I've spent certainly a lot of my life up north, right? And when I visit Miami, I often do. I look at it, I'm like, you are so unfamiliar to me, right? It's become such. I mean, just every year when I visit, it's just dramatically changing and shifting. But I think what continues to draw me to it, which is unique. A lot of cities have stories, origin stories, things like that. But what continues to draw me to it is the way in which like these popular stories about Miami and South Florida have dramatically influenced life in those areas, right? Like I think of a city as three different things, right? Like as physical place, buildings, things that you move through, streets that you navigate, right? The stories we tell about the cities, and then the people who are actually living there and experiencing that, right? And what I see in Miami, in its history, from its origin, is a city in which the stories that are told about it have had like a really dramatic impact in how that city is actually constructed and built, and where resources go, right? In ways that are a lot more clean cut than other cities that I've taken interest in, right? So there's something very modern about it, very kind of peculiar about it. So part of the reason why I keep coming back to it, and really just wanting to kind of have access to it, but in a different way, not necessarily because I'm trying to find my community or anything like that at this stage, but it's more because I feel like so much of Miami sometimes can be closed off because of wealth or class or division. And when I write about it, there's a certain power of the imagination and being able to cut through some of those spaces and gain access that I think really interests me as a project. It is familiar, like you say. There's a lot there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of times, we write to get back to something or to continue to sort of process that thing. So maybe just that experience of like you said, not trying to connect again with your community, but just to sort of understand the ways in which it continues to shift, could be a reason. Ben, yes, has a question. Go ahead, Ben.
Hey, Raul. So
Hey.
you were talking about needing to get these stories published and painting Miami in a different light, and that got me wondering, did you intend to publish these stories as a collection, or did you want to like publish them independently in these different journals? Because they all kind of seem to stand out as just they read as standalone hits, and they kind of I don't know. I just wanted to know what your intentions with them were, I guess.
Hey, thank you. Over the span of, it's funny, I wrote my first short story in my first creative writing class, right? and it was largely because I got there. I used to write. I would always draft novels and write these failed projects, and my creative writing instructor said, you need to write a short story for this assignment. I was like, what's that? I didn't read them often. I didn't write them. And I resisted it a little bit at first, came to really admire the process and appreciate what you could get from studying the story and all of that. But so this is a long way of saying that over the course of, I guess since about 2002 or 2003, right, I've been writing stories here and there and kind of collecting like this like portfolio of stories. It's a bunch of them, and I've often tried to, for years, I tried experimenting with trying to figure out, do some of these belong together? Do they seem to seem cohesive in any sense? And there were times, I think, when I would just kind of force stories together and just send them out and see, is somebody going to publish this book? More recently, what is it? When I eventually went on submission with this collection, I became really interested in trying to get at the tensions within the Cuban American community and the tensions between the Cuban American community and Cubans, and then Cuban Americans and the larger Latinx. An opportunity there to explore something that I hadn't seen done a lot. So I selected these stories from others that I'd written, the majority of these, as kind of falling under a similar project, and then ended up actually writing 2 additional stories to try to make it seem complete. The 2 additional stories, one was the Stand Your Ground that I just read, and then the other one was Immaculate Mulch. And then after writing those 2, I was like, oh, this feels a little more intentional. And that was the process by how it all came together.
Awesome. Love the explication. Is there a you just give me 1 second. I had a question while you were talking. So the while you were publishing them, like you had a couple get picked up by journals, independent publishers. Did you get like, I'm kind of curious about what that time frame was, and did you publish one and then you got more attention from editors and then that kind of snowballed, or was it like a slow and gradual process, or you found an editor and then they got you out to like a bunch of different journals or something like that?
It was actually a very slow and excruciating process. I remember I haven't submitted a short story now for publication in a while, and it's largely just because I've been busy with with this book coming out and then with the novel. But for as long as I can remember, each one of these stories got rejected 6, 7, 8, 20 times, depending on which one it was. And it's always been difficult to break in. I know that's not always the case for all writers, but in this particular case, I appreciate you saying that that you found the story strong. At the time when I was submitting, there was a lot of doubt, because I'd send these out and I'd get just kind of a simple rejection, and I'd think, am I doing this right? Is there? And I think certainly when I put the book together, I returned to it, put on my editorial cap and returned to it, and tried to shape them a bit more, make them more intentional. But it's been the stories in particular have been an uphill battle.
Well, I think, or go ahead. Sorry, Ben, do you want to speak to that?
No, I just want to say awesome. Thanks. I'm done hogging all the time.
Well, I think that you're really speaking to such a common experience as authors, the self-doubt, the imposter syndrome, the constant rejections that, sort of begin to weigh on you. But now, you have this collection of stories, and then also very recently your novel came out. What was that process? Because there was another question in the chat just about the, sort of the publishing process overall. How maybe was that different, getting the novel out as opposed to the collection of stories for you?
Oh, sure. And I'll say something also before answering that. Something that I want to say as well is that even though sometimes it was difficult, the process doubt, things of that nature, I always found that when I would sit down to write, I really enjoyed it. Right. It felt very fulfilling, very affirming. And sometimes I would look over and my wife would be like, hey, you're going to help around here. And I'd be like, I got to write my story, but it was challenging at times, but I loved the process of getting lost in a work of fiction, things like that. And I say that only because I think that the process, if it gets difficult, the process, I think, ultimately saves us. It's why we do what we do, right? To experience that. And I'll say that things have moved really fast. I won the Don Belton Prize with the story collection. And then it seemed within months, the novel was then getting acquired by Dutton, by a Dream editor, Pilar Garcia Brown. And I think both were things that were in work for quite a bit of time. They just kind of happened to appear like they all coalesced at the same moment. The novel was actually a short story originally. Direction I wanted it to, probably because it needed to be a novel, right? And both Indiana University Press and Dutton both gave each manuscript a lot of love, a lot of care. They're different experiences publishing through a university press as opposed to major imprint and through Penguin and Random House. So they've been different in that sense. That I have at Dutton, I have this amazing marketing team that sends me, things to post on Instagram, right? And I'm like, thank you so much for sending me this, right? With the collection, I have to build a lot of that myself, and I think there are ways that that you could get a lot of support from a larger press, and at the same time, it was a university press that kind of welcomed me into the fold and got the ball rolling to begin with, right? And invited this kind of very bold collection of stories.
Thank you to speaking to that, and for Zoixa and Diana, who had questions in the chat about just the overall publishing process. Let's see, I saw Manuel, and then we'll go to Spurgeon.
Hello again. So I just want to premise by saying, like, you don't have to answer this because it's kind of more of like a personal question. So it's up to you whether you're comfortable or not. But there was a particular part in your previous answer that you said, like, about your wife, that was like, oh, when are you gonna like help around? And I understand that she probably meant like in terms of chores and whatnot, but I took it as more of like, when are you going to help out in terms of like getting a job or being financially stable or helping around the house in that aspect type of thing? Because as a writer, it is scary to not have like a financial cushion or whatever you want to call it. And I do understand that most writers have a job. Like some of them are teachers, some of them do this, do that. And the whole writing part is like a side hustle, if you want to call it, right? But some people use that as their main hustle. So my question is, when you were writing these stories or when you're writing in general, at the time where there was nothing there, did you fear like the sense of not being a provider, or did you fear like income not coming in and you're not doing your part, or did you feel some sort of guilt because you're out here, I guess you can classify it as fooling around while your wife or somebody else would be doing the adult thing to do? I guess that would be my question.
Yeah, I'll say too that the novel is a big answer to that question. Deals with debt and things, and it emerged from those very emotions, right? I'll say that my work life is a bit unorthodox. I think right now I'm an associate professor and associate dean at Ithaca College. But I didn't go my line through academia wasn't linear, right? In fact, I got a degree in fiction writing from Columbia College, and then moved back to Miami. And I worked in sales, in business development for 6, 7, 8 years. I forget how many. So I did that thing of having the kind of the outside sales job where maybe I was selling maintenance parts to farmers or manufacturers, or even kind of fleet service operators in the Southwest Florida, in the Everglades. And I'd be out there working with my clients, pulling over to the side of the road, right, and kind of picking up some of the old books that I would study as an undergrad to kind of revisit them, or sitting there and writing. I had this kind of right after my undergraduate work, right, I landed in the business world, and it was a tough time because of the subprime mortgage crisis, and there were a lot of kind of economic catastrophes that were occurring. But there was a path there toward like a management position ultimately at a particular organization, with a little more security and things like that. And it was actually my wife, who I credit with, just kind of the beauty of her imagination, right? What she's able to see that I couldn't see at the time because I was scared financially, right? Like, you got to have something secure, I was thinking, right? She told me, you really want to do this the rest of your life, right? Like, we have this opportunity right now where we could maybe potentially pursue some of our passions. So we both went back to school together. And by the time I was enrolled in a PhD program that was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the stipend was, $16,000 a year, which in Nebraska, it gets you pretty far, right? Or it used to. I don't know how it is nowadays. Right. But it was still, if you're keeping up with your friends from high school and stuff, everybody's buying a house, and I'm sitting there reading critical theory and, writing my dissertation, and it's kind of mind blowing, right? The whole process. So I think there was a lot of insecurity, uncertainty, fear. I know a lot of writers that have that as well, and but what held true through the whole process was when I would sit down to do it, I knew that it was right. I knew that I enjoyed it. And I knew also, because I had this experience in sales and business, that worst case scenario, right, I could somehow figure out a way to, make a buck here and get by. I think we valued, pursuing our passions, our interests, and put a lot on the line. It was tricky. Yeah.
Well, we very much appreciate your wife then as well, because we wouldn't be here tonight. And and being a writer, right, we know it's hard, as we were just talking about, but I think there's something that always just pulls you to the page. So even if you maybe had continued down that sales route, maybe you would have circled back at some point, right? There's always that thing that compels us, that we really can't escape, right? That voice, that nagging thing.
Sure.
Spurgeon, yes. Are you in a place where, or do you want me to? Okay, it's still loud. All right. So Spurgeon just worried about too much noise in the background. So he wanted to know what instantly puts you in the writing mood.
I used to be a lot more strict about that, right? Like, there had to be a particular mood, right? I had to have to light a little candle. If there was anybody in the room, you're like, get out of here, right? I'm closing this door, putting on my headphones, that whole thing. What is it? We have a 10-year-old daughter, and then also in my current role, it's just, things are always crazy busy, and so there's no longer a mood. Right? It's more like, okay, on my schedule it says I'm supposed to write right now. I have 1 hour to do it. Here we go. You know, and I sit there, and I think the best thing that can emerge from that session is that by the end of it, I'm like, oh, I wish I had more time to continue, right? As opposed to like, I'm so glad that's over. I wish I had more time to continue so that when the next little hour comes along in a day or so, there's this kind of momentum, right? You know, and that's all to say that right now I'm working on something new, and I haven't actually sat down to draft it. I'm just reading the kinds of books that I want to be in conversation with, being observant, taking notes, just kind of preparing. Maybe another way of approaching that question is getting everything I need in front of me so that when I do have time to write, I can access the mood somehow. You know, yeah.
Are you able to share anything about that new project at this point, or is it still, I mean, would you rather just keep us in suspense?
I'm happy to. I'm rereading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and it's had been a while since I'd read it. I'm just kind of blown away by it, particularly the first 4 chapters. I'm like, whoa, I had forgotten all of that because I was so fixated on the creature, right? I'm looking at, of course, I'm returning to Miami, but I'm thinking more along the lines of what is it? What is Miami going to look like 200-300 years from now? What is Miami going to look like when it no longer even or another? So I'm thinking in terms of kind of tourism after a city, right? Very vague. I know this is cryptic, but I'm also looking at competing epistemologies where I'm imagining, like a biologist and a documentary maker involved in a project, and kind of resurrecting certain stories about a city. So very early in the process, but just tinkering right now.
Well, that sounds exciting, and just, I don't know, the idea of the tourism industry as monster, as creature, or maybe more as like Dr. Frankenstein, the true monster of the novel.
That's right.
Okay, there was a question in the chat. So we'll do a few more. So Elsa was wondering, something that came out in our discussion of the stories was, she says, I noticed you often write from an outsider's perspective looking in, and often being disconnected from the consequences or issues that the other characters are facing in the story. Do you have any reason or preferences for writing from this narrative perspective?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the question of like, why write this story, right? Why is it that we tell certain stories? Why when there's an event that occurs or when something happens, why is it that we wrap a narrative around it in a particular way? So I kind of distill it just down to narrative desire, right? What's kind of the internal hidden logic behind why the story is being told, and what does it all amount to? I like that idea. I really like playing with this idea of a speaker, a protagonist who's also a narrator, right? Who has a lot of hidden baggage, but is not willing to be vulnerable, is not willing to share those secrets, just kind of holds it close, but who's fixated on something, is kind of captivated by an event or something that happened in the past, right? Because there's it's a lot of fun to kind of just explore that interplay, right? Behind like a remembered story, an event, and then something that the narrator's trying to say but can't, so it's very, very deliberate, and I appreciate the question for noticing it and asking about it.
Yeah, some of the stories felt almost like sort of like first person peripheral, but really just so human. The idea of not wanting to be vulnerable, or the sort of like the masks that we wear, or just even the way in which we try to communicate, but we kind of fall short in such a way because of that we don't want to be vulnerable or say what we actually mean. So that was very, very relatable in the stories.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Ben, go ahead. Another question.
So I kind of shifting gears here. Back to the stories. The story Never Through Miami. I love the structure of it, and like I love how like the narrator introduced Madeline, and like she was just standoffish, and they had this like fluke weekend tryst, and it never meant anything. But by the end of the story, you realize that like they were the most meaningful relationship each other had. Um, so I was just kind of wondering like how you go about structuring that. It almost felt like you would have to write it backwards. Like I was trying to reverse engineer how that process would go. But also I'm kind of curious about like the psychological aspect of it, because like is Madeline really like some type of Black Widow serial killer, and the narrator's just is he a victim and he has like Stockholm syndrome, or like did I miss a couple something? I like that's one of the stories I'm going to go back and reread.
Yeah, that story was like a fever dream, It was I remember what is it? I heard it was after going to visit Cuba. I heard a story. I think it was actually on the way back. I heard a story about how there was a brief moment when when it was possible for Cubans to fly to Miami with relative ease, so long as they had the resources to do so. And I heard a story about a Cuban American flight attendant who took the passport of a Cuban and said, no, like, let me see that, right? Like, let me save you, right? It was something along those lines, right? Like, why don't go back to Cuba, stay here, right? And I remember hearing that, I was like, whoa, right? Like that is wild. In particular, hearing that after traveling to Cuba was interesting, because what is it? I met a few people, many who were in the tourism industry, who had the means to travel because they were benefiting from that industry, this kind of soft economy. So I think the ideas emerged there, right? It seemed like such a live wire in the tensions within the Cuban American diaspora, right? And I started really thinking, in a very kind of satirical and playful way. What is it? What would happen if you took this kind of conservative Cuban American ideology, right, and just kind of put that bar on maximum all the way to the right, and see where it leads. So that was part of that. You know, I think that story leads with satire and this commentary on exploitation and things like that, and consumerism. And then within the psychology, there in particular, Madeli is like a black box, right? Like, what is she thinking? What is really going on? She comes through in moments of vulnerability in ways that are often surprising. And at other times, she seems like a caricature, right? And certainly the protagonist describes her that way, like a super mujer in the supermarket or things like that. But what was fun about that story was actually the playing with plot. Right? I don't know if that's maybe the best way to say it, but playing with certain conventions that come from like a detective, story or something, right? Where there's a mystery, there's a detective, right? Who's doing the investigation, who's being played, right? And like anything that happens in Cuba, there's nothing is as it seems, right? Everything always can be seen 2 or 3 different ways. So there was a desire on my end to kind of replicate that. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer.
No, yeah, that was awesome.
Awesome.
All right. Well, I know we have kept you up very late already, Raul, but if you can answer one more question for us before we depart tonight. So I noticed, you're very adept at what I like to think of as like writing the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why, your stories, your work overall it's so relatable, it's so human. Or where other avenues do you get inspiration from? I notice a lot of like musical references, even in the story that you read, Stand Your Ground. I mean, there's P.D. Pablo, there's Tribe Called Quest. I mean, there's sort of a lot of other aspects, but maybe when you feel stuck, where else do you turn to for inspiration?
It's always the first place is always I just pick up some books and start reading. Return to books I'm passionate about, pick up new books. What is it? I often in terms of process, right? Like I feel comfortable just kind of tinkering on a page and playing and putting a word down and having fun with it and all of that. But when it comes to really kind of thinking about or really kind of considering what's the shape of this particular story, or what shape is this actually going to take, or what movements is it going to pursue. I find that when I know who I'm in conversation with, it's a lot easier to realize those possibilities. And sometimes what is it? I'll start. I get kind of like locked into like making allusions or references to multiple sources, and it all becomes really convoluted for me and messy, and it's exciting, like what's going to emerge from that mixture. Right. So I'd say that's the first place. And I also do silly things, like I was just in South Bend, Indiana, and me and a friend went to Target. And we walked by the water fountain, and there was this poster, and it had like the employee of the month, and it had like a picture of the whole Target team. And I was like, I'm taking a picture of that, right? Because there's so much there. You look at those photos closely, and I don't know, these kind of beautiful observations emerge, right, from something that just maybe you wouldn't pay attention to otherwise. It's yeah. There's so much to pull from, but it's generally reading, being in conversation, and really observing and listening really closely. Just provides this bank of material to just play with.
Well, thank you. I feel like that's a great like writing prompt that you have right there. So everyone go to like a store, look for a water fountain, and go from there. Find an object that intrigues you, and
that's right.
Get weird.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's thank Raul for his time. If you want to unmute yourself, show your appreciation. We're out here in the virtual ether. We so appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, so much fun getting a chance to chat with you all.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us and spending time in the virtual ether with us tonight. And Raul, we're very excited to see this next project. It sounds absolutely intriguing. And, maybe at that point, we'll get you out to San Diego.
Oh, sweet. That'd be fun.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Be safe. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. And I'll see my students again soon. And Raul, thank you again so much. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yes, thank you. All right. Good night, everybody.
Hey, good night, you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.